about ready. Welcome everybody, and we have a very graphic Bible study text for today. So this is not salt and light anymore. I have to change that. It's adultery and divorce. So we have quite a different story here. So did anybody think about leaving your gift at the altar before you worship and go talk to your brother or sister? That was last week. We don't see anybody, so there's nobody to fight with, I guess, except your spouse or your roommate.
I thought about it when I read it.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about the inner workings of the heart. Someone labeled that this Bible study. So maybe we ought to hear what Eugene Peterson has for that section. Do you have that, Larry? Oh, you're muted, Larry.
You want me to read those five verses, Gail?
27 to 32. Right, go read the whole thing, maybe. Welcome, Fred.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I had trouble finding you. You were in spam.
Oh, my word. Oh, something always happens.
Sorry
Okay.
about that. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Reading from the Message, starting with verse 27, you know the next commandment pretty well, too. Don't go to bed with another spouse, but don't think you've preserved your virtue simply by staying out of bed. Your heart can be corrupted by lust even quicker than your body. Those leering looks you think nobody notices, they are also corrupt. Let's not pretend this is easier than it really is. If you want to live a morally pure life, here's what you have to do. You have to blind your right eye the moment you catch it in a lustful leer. You have to choose to live one-eyed or else be dumped on a moral trash pile. And you have to drop off your right hand the moment you notice it raised threateningly. Better a bloody stump than your entire being discarded for good in the dump.
Wow.
Remember the scripture that says, whoever divorces his wife, let him do it legally, giving her divorce papers and her legal rights. Too many of you are using that as a cover for selfishness and whim, pretending to be righteous just because you are legal. Please, no more pretending. If you divorce your wife, you're responsible for making her an adulteress, unless she has already made herself that by sexual promiscuity. And if you marry such a divorced adulteress, you're automatically an adulterer yourself. You cannot use legal cover to mask a moral failure.
Wow. That's version is longer than it gives a lot more details, doesn't it?
Yes.
So the inner workings of the heart. So this is more than just about adultery or about divorce. It seems to be that you could have lots of things that could get you into trouble. Is what Jesus might be saying. So from this, let's see, this book, this, I guess it was a Sermon on the Mount book that says, um, often we read this section as a message about personal purity. And he talks about that Eugene Peterson said, if you want to be pure, that is only part of the issue. A deeper issue has to do with sexuality and marriage, the concern for the well-being of one's marriage partner. Inner loyalties of the heart are equally important. In the kingdom of heaven, covenants between persons are honored. So we know marriage is an old tradition. It must have been um, even in the time of the Old Testament. So we've been trying to figure out marriage for a long time now. I don't know, Lyle and Vivian, you've probably been married the longest of any of us. You've got it figured out now.
Yeah. I just do what she says.
Well, it's interesting. This passage seems to all be towards the male. Almost all of it is geared toward the man, except if the woman has done sexual immorality. So these things are seemingly to be pointed for the male population, but I don't know that that would be. I don't know that women are off the hook any more than men are. I think the main thing is talking about purity, and we have a lot of conversation in our denomination about purity. Um, what what do we know about this call to purity? Is that something that um, we've ever attained? Can we ever reach purity?
I think we should strive towards it.
Strive towards purity?
Strive towards it.
And
And as far as being married this many years, my comment is I really appreciate having hair during COVID.
oh
It's
yeah,
a lot less lonesome.
right. Being in a house with no one but you inside the four walls, that's not always going to work out very well. That's good.
Well, purity comes up in a lot of places. One could say, okay, if we're going to talk about the Pharisees, for example, and Jesus's discussions with, different places, kind of looks like he foregrounds or puts, makes more important some issues than purity, right? I mean, lepers, women at the well, the woman with who has who's bleeding. All those are impure kinds of things. The Pharisees are saying, "Oh, you can't do that stuff." Jesus says, "Oh, yeah, you can, and you better, you should." So there's something beyond purity that's important.
And being in close contact with persons that are impure um, wasn't allowed for priests, and so um, the followers of Jesus thought that he was sometimes way off the mark when he would do that. Why are you talking to that woman? They would ask. Why do you let those children bother you? So purity is not the only goal. Is that what you're saying, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus raises questions about that issue, and I think you could argue that Christian interpretation has equated purity with Judaism in general, and in other words, it's like legalism, and I think there are certainly interpreters who say you got to be careful. In other words, you can't just make a blanket statement like that. So then it starts to become an anti-Jewish thing. In the history of interpretation.
So the Jews were off the mark and Jesus was on the mark. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that so for example, Jews only care about the law, only care about purity. We wrestled with that a little bit with the Good Samaritan story in different ways to think about that.
Right. So what is interesting to me is that it talks about Eugene Peterson says that that you're you can't be off the hook if you think that you're going to just follow the legal rules. So this whole passage, you have heard it said, that's the old way of thinking. But really, if you divorce your wife, what kind of living? How could a woman make a living in the biblical times without without being allowed to have a career or work in the marketplace? Seems like there was only one um, one occupation that was left for her, right?
Pretty limited.
What's that?
Pretty limited.
Yeah, she could be a prostitute or not be able to be able to survive. So divorce would have been a pretty big deal. So if I just say, um, it's if anyone divorces his wife, you just give her a certificate. Well, that says one thing for a man, but a different thing for a woman. I get a certificate, and then what? Can't eat much with a certificate of divorce, evidently.
I knew a Seventh-day Adventist lady who had left her husband. He was very physically abusive. He would just beat the thunder out of her. And but I asked her about if she'd ever considered remarrying, and she said no. I can't remarry unless my husband has a sexual relationship with another woman, and then he would have committed adultery, and then I would be free to marry, and I would be justified in divorce and marrying. And I thought that was kind of a sad thing to be to be trapped by that.
So that was her biblical interpretation of
Right.
this scripture.
Yeah, her interpretation was that she was not free to really divorce except for cause of adultery, and she could leave him, but unless he had a physical relationship with another woman, she would not be justified in actually divorcing and remarrying.
Yeah, so that's pretty letter of the law, isn't it? I would say her interpretation.
I thought it was pretty, my view of the divine would be that that the divine would be very accepting of you leaving a relationship in which you're being regularly physically abused or emotionally abused, for that matter.
Right. And that's part of the theological um, abuse that women are sometimes told by religious leaders that they need to stay in a marriage no matter what. And so that's been a problem for a long time, I think, without, the bigger picture is the covenant that you've made, which doesn't include, I don't think the covenant included physical or emotional abuse in the covenant.
Well, Fred, what you described, I mean, I'm not an early Brethren scholar, but I'm pretty sure what you described would have been what the Brethren would have held in the 19th century, for example, for the most part. Maybe not everybody, but and other groups as well. So
Yeah. Well, this lady was Seventh-day Adventist. I don't know if I said that or not, but
Yeah,
You
yeah.
did. You did.
But I think, the point being is that historically, that's a pretty common, I think, Christian interpretation.
Well, and that leads me to my next question. When do we take the Sermon on the Mount literally? So um, that's the part that scares me, is when we pick and choose which parts we're going to take literally. So he says that if your right eye should be your downfall, tear it out. And if your right hand offends you, then you should cut it off. So I guess, does that mean that if your left hand offends you, that you don't have to cut it off?
well, wouldn't we question someone's mental stability if they did that in today's
Mhm.
world?
Yes.
Right. Well, hopefully we would question that.
I mean, wouldn't be very excited about cutting off my body parts because I did something wrong with them or thought about it.
Yeah. So there would not, yeah, who could claim to be pure of any error or any stumble? That would be almost next to impossible. So we talk about the Sermon on the Mount being such an important scripture for us that brethren take it literally. Now I'm a little bit worried.
Reminds me, there's a novel I read. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Wally Lamb, Lamb. But he wrote a novel called I Know This Much Is True. And one of the things that's part of that novel is somebody literally cutting their hand off. So then there's a lot to that novel, but clearly there have been some folks who do think in this way. Yeah.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. What do you take literally and act on, and what don't you, and what factors do you consider when you're making that decision?
Which really brings us back to the purity question. Why do we pick and choose some of those scriptures that we like better than others? One of my favorite quotes is, "We all like to take the Bible literally until it comes to the topic of gluttony."
Well, and how do you define purity? I mean, how do we have a common definition for it, or is our definition today the same as the definition during Christ's time? Is it an accurate translation of that word?
Yeah, so um, and what's the definition of purity? And then what did Jesus do around people who were not pure? That's I think what Dave was saying. I keep thinking, the woman at the well. This is he says. This is not your husband. What you said is true. You've had 7 husbands, or whatever, how many ever it was. And I think that's in Luke.
I think it was 7.
Or
I think it's in John.
John. Yeah, it's a chapter in John. And so Jesus didn't seem to shun her, but he gave her some of the greatest scriptures that are in the Bible. If anybody who thirsts, come to me, and I have living water, and you will never thirst again. Is that purity?
Well, I'm thinking there's a couple of thoughts I have. One, I mean, I just did a real quick look over in Luke. Luke doesn't talk about the divorce stuff in his version of the Sermon on the Mount for whatever reason. I mean, there's other places where Luke does, but not there. Which also, it reminds me, so Matthew and Luke, like I think we tend to read the Sermon on the Mount like it's a verbatim teaching of Jesus. And really Matthew and Luke are crafting, their understandings of what we call it Sermon on the Mount. I mean, there's no title of that in the text. So that, that's an interpretive move as well. So that, it's part of the tradition, and that's fine. But and the third thing, I was just thinking about this adultery thing, and remembering Jimmy Carter and how that got him in trouble. I don't know if you remember, but Jimmy Carter during his presidency was interviewed by a Playboy reporter, and he referenced this particular verse, and I'm not sure I ever read that article, although I'm sure it's online to see how, what exactly, how the reporter reported it. But I do remember it being in the media, right? It was quite, like today it seems like that's pretty tame compared to some of the stuff we hear about our presidents talking about, but it wasn't at the time.
And he said that I'm guilty of adultery because of this verse, right?
Yeah, he said, I struggle with having lust. I mean, looking and lust in my heart, and which is a fairly standard way of reading that.
So, what would be the criteria for us to know blessed are the peacemakers? Are we supposed to take that literally? And if your right hand offends you, cut it off? What's the criteria between, there's just separated by a few verses?
Good question.
Well, I think when I read about this in the booklet, it was talking about how this is where Jesus really overstated it to make the point that he really didn't want you to take out your eye or cut off your hand, but he wanted you to know it was really, really important.
Yeah, I wonder what people's reaction was. The first ones to hear this, they would have had this this shocked reaction. I would think, cut off your hand. What do you mean, cut off your hand?
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, Vivian, because we do know that, rhetoric is the art of persuasion, right? Of putting arguments together. And, again, that's not my field particularly, but it'd be interesting in terms of the Sermon on the Mount. So what's the rhetorical strategy? What's being argued, and how is it being argued? And sometimes we know that people make, when they make an argument, to prove a point, they make it really, really strong, or really, really, I'm losing the words to try to describe it. But if you want to persuade somebody,
Dramatic.
Yeah, dramatic, worst case scenario, all that sort of stuff. And Jesus being a storyteller, I'm sure did that kind of thing. That's what you do when you tell stories, or when you're trying to make a point. Preachers do it all the time. Right, Fred?
Certainly not.
Well, this came from the website Lectio Divina, and this author just says these affirmations cannot be taken literally. They indicate the radical nature and the seriousness with which Jesus insists on this. So, if we took a vote, how many of you want to take this serious literally? I mean, I don't think that many in society would care to go down that route. And so it's frustrating to me that sometimes people want to throw out "Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn," and throw it all out and saying, "Well, Jesus didn't really mean that because, well, nobody can do that." So, um, how do we know what is our marching orders, and what's our what's our obligation as faithful followers?
Isn't that one of the reasons that maybe that there are so many different denominations? One of the contributing factors could be different ones of us take different pieces literally versus figuratively or metaphorically or whatever.
Right. And it doesn't different verses speak to people and call people's hearts very potently. So the brethren have got that part about "Blessed are the peacemakers" and have taken it to heart. And the one about "Leave your gift at the altar and go to your brother or sister if you have something against if they have something against you." We like to think that one we take to heart also. How many of the disciples had their right hands cut off, I wonder?
Well, and I've never seen or heard of a reference of that actually happening scripturally in anything that I'm familiar with, although I'm not familiar with much in the Apocrypha, but not in our scriptures.
Yeah, you don't see it in the Paul's writings or the letters, but they do talk about marriage in some of those letters and adultery.
But to me, we also have to remember that a lot of this was written, quite some time after he preached the Sermon on the Mount. It wasn't like it was tape recorded that day and transcribed the next.
Right, exactly. So I would remember this if someone said to pluck out your eye. I think that would stand out in my memory for a while. So I'm sure that it got somebody's attention and long enough to get it in your memory to write it down 50, 60, 70 years later.
Mhm.
Well, it would be interesting, and again, I'm thinking about it in terms of our own context. You know, annual conference would have wrestled with this issue and what the different viewpoints would have been. I'm talking about divorce in particular. Um, obviously, we treat divorce differently again than the 19th or 18th century that did. And I'm sure there would have been some, they actually, there probably some of that argumentation would be interesting in terms of the issues that we're arguing about today, like homosexuality and others. You know, what kind of rhetorical strategies people were using to argue their point, um, and how I mean, even reading an annual conference statement might be interesting in terms of analyzing some of that in terms of the arguments and how they interpret. I mean, I'm sure they wrestled with this passage, for example.
Right, and you can go on brethren.org and see the annual conference statements. And um, the, the, the topic they wrestled with the most, like 100 and some times with annual conference, was the mode of foot washing. And so they could not agree with the single method or the double method. And I really um, don't think it matters to anybody nowadays, but boy, it was such hotly debated. And then divorce was in there. I did a study one time of all the topics that, how many times they came up, and it was pretty amazing that we were not of one mind. We did not figure this out very well, and people would still have differing points of view today at annual conference about divorce.
But Before you get too far from the foot washing piece, I was totally unaware that there was, what was the debate?
Well, there was one method where if someone would be like Jesus and wash everybody's feet, and then the other method was I wash your feet, you wash the next foot, and you go around. And so it was the theological difference of who was doing the foot washing, and so people had clearly had grown up with different traditions, and they weren't willing to let go of what they thought was the most important one. I guess the one that won out would be called the double mode, where each person washes someone else's feet, but only of the same sex, evidently.
Well, when one person washed everybody else's feet, was that then who had the responsibility for doing that?
Yeah, I don't know if it was the pastor who did that or an elder, probably an elder. And we don't have elders anymore, but it would have been yeah, maybe. And I haven't studied up on it that much to see how you decide who's the foot washer.
That's interesting.
Well, I
Sorry, I mean to diverge, but
learn history
I
of
was
that.
just curious.
The old order may still do the single mode.
Yeah,
That is,
they're the only two groups, I think, us and the old orders, that really carry that tradition. Well, we take it literally again. It said it in the scripture in John, and we took it literally. So I've been thinking about the Muslim legal punishment was to chop off someone's hand in Nigeria, right, for stealing.
mhm.
Well, that would discourage you.
That was the
It was
Sometimes,
Dr. Bittinger that told about talking them out of, or one of those early missionaries tried to get them to not to chop off a hand of a youth that had taken something they shouldn't have, I think.
wow.
Yeah, he
sometimes,
stole something like a tin can. It was something that was not of any great value, and they were going to chop his hand off because he was a thief. And of course, Bittinger stopped them from doing it. But the whole idea was back in there, that's what Muslims do.
sometimes in the market, if someone would get caught stealing, very soon a mob could even kill the person. Not
Yeah.
worrying about cutting his hand off or anything, but just killing.
Mm.
Wow.
And that's a literal interpretation, evidently, of following Muhammad in the legal command.
So they struggle with the same issues that we do because the Muslims or at least the ones that I visited with in the States, would not adopt that as a position.
No, hopefully not.
No.
Well, and what's interesting in terms of the, I taught a survey course, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, for several years now, and I'm not an Islamic scholar, but what I learned was that just like in Christianity, there are schools of interpretation, same way in Islam, and we've been a little bit. I mean, the last 20 years since 9/11, there's all this, radical Islam, it's out to kill everybody. And that is, for the most part, it's like fundamentalism in Christianity. I mean, it's there, but it's certainly not the primary way of thinking of Islam worldwide, and it never has been. There's always been incredible diversity and discussion and debate. Judaism does it with the Talmud. We do it, among our interpretations. I was thinking about divorce again. We didn't mention, like Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism at least in its most, I mean, they definitely don't think divorce is right. There's a lot of divorced Catholics though, right? I mean, we're humans.
Right.
And,
So,
and that gets to be kind of a semantic, or must be a semantic thing part of the time too, because I had an uncle who was married and to a Catholic gal in a Catholic wedding. And when he came back from the service, I don't know what happened, but the marriage was annulled, whatever that term means.
And that was right after the wedding, Fred?
I don't know how soon after he went overseas
Yeah.
in the war.
Yeah, annulment. What my understanding of annulment is that the marriage is not. I mean, it can be about being consummated sexually, but also, gosh, the Kennedys wrestled with this too, and I'm forgetting about why that was. Because there was an annulment. I guess it was for Ted Kennedy and his wife, but yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's into details that I don't know a lot about, but obviously there is a mechanism for that.
yeah, I think it stretched to beyond its original intent for many modern Catholics. I think they have stretched it, but when they when the couple has 3 or 4 kids and then they have an annulment, it seems a little odd. But I've known that to happen. So we get so why are there so many denominations? I think that's partly what we're talking about, because if we're going to focus only on law, then it would be okay to chop off your hand and pluck out your eye. And I'm sure that there are persons that would be attracted to that kind of black and white thinking that makes it easy to decide if you're pure or not pure. We've been watching this show on TV, Hillbilly Elegy. It was a book that was turned into a movie, and they're very religious, and they have a different kind of understanding. Like, you can slap and punch your own family, but if someone else tries to punch you, you're allowed to let all hell break loose. But you don't, if your parent punches or slaps you, you don't fight back. But if someone else tries to harm you, the whole family is going to go after you. So that's kind of the culture differences that attracts people to different kind of faith traditions, I think. Like Vicky was saying, we don't have parents that taught us to say, you know, go and punch that guy back. Usually we don't have parents that say, if someone punches you, make sure you win the argument and you're the last one standing. My parental advice would have been to don't get in a fight, whatever you do.
I had kids that I worked with, families that I worked with. I remember one where the dad, they had 2 sons, and because the one son was a lot bigger than the other son, if they would get in a fight, he would give the younger son a knife to even out the fight.
Mm.
And
Mm.
we ended up having
Mm.
to find a different home for the kids, but I
Wow,
thought it was an interesting perspective.
that was good parenting in his perspective, I suppose.
Well, that's the way he was raised, so.
Wow.
I was looking at this Sermon on the Mount and listening to our discussion, and it seems like the Church of the Brethren has become more, and I don't know what the proper term is, whether it's liberal or tolerant or less literal or what phrases you want to use. Does that, and it seems to me like, do all denominations start more conservatively, fundamentally, and move toward a more tolerant excuse me, a more tolerant or liberal or whatever term you want to use position? What do you think?
I think it depends where you're at. I remember when the brethren argued at great length whether it would be possible for a Church of the Brethren minister with adequate counseling, extensive counseling, to be able to marry someone who had been divorced. And that wasn't that totally long ago, long enough for me to remember it, but and it wasn't a unanimous feeling. If you read the statement of faith of the Covenant Brethren group, who are now schismatics, you find they're still on the other side of that. Once married, that's it, forever and ever. And so we're not a liberal church by any ways. Out here we are. The original brethren were Alexander Mack, and those folks were far more liberal than the folks in between. So we have the conservative brethren who are a very hard wing of this. It's morally wrong, the whole thing, and we excommunicate, and the rest of us follow the original brethren, Alexander Mack and those folks, who thought we should live with difference and not write a creed, not force everyone to the same ideas, and to listen to people who thought different from ourselves and live with difference.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a good summary. And I think, to me, what I read about Stages of Faith by Fowler, and it seems to me that the human being goes through different stages where legalism is was one of the stages, and I see things in those terms, and I can see no other until something traumatic or dramatic happens to me to help me move into a different stage of faith. So I would say that in every faith tradition, there are still legal and more grace filled in every religion that we've discussed so far. So I think it doesn't have to do um, with a denomination. I think it's the whole gamut is there, and then where does our faith growth take us? How does that journey take us? If I've been around persons who've been um, persecuted for being divorced, I probably have a different faith journey than someone who's never met a divorced person. Or if I've met someone who's been um, considering suicide because of their being gay or lesbian, I have a different faith journey, perhaps, than someone who's never met a gay or lesbian person or had conversation with them.
Well, maybe another way to put that is to say that pastoral concerns will cause you to reread the text and to think about the text in a different way. I mean, not to say that that's the only thing that's important, but if a person's being physically abused horrifically in a marriage relationship, that's got to change. I mean, it's not right. There are other ethical issues that you can say are biblical that come from that.
Right. Yeah, well said. And this isn't the only passage that Jesus talks, that the scriptures talk about marriage either. And sometimes they contradict one another. So I think we get stuck between conscience and community. So the community might all say that you're going to hell, but my conscience might be telling me that I'm not going to hell for leaving an abusive husband or whatever. And so I can prove my point with Scripture, and they can prove their point with Scripture. Then what do we do?
Well, I think it's also interesting, we pretty quickly have, we're sure we shouldn't be cutting our hands off or gouging our eyes out. In other words, oh yeah, that is really, I mean, we can take that and not in a literal fashion, but the verse before and the verses after we do. So yeah, there's just something that doesn't quite fit. In other words, gosh, I'm the one who decides what's literal and what's not. Gosh, that's a tough one. I mean, I don't want to be the person who's making that decision about all the verses in the Bible.
Well, and don't, or at least for me in my life, my views of Scripture have changed dramatically from what they were in my younger years. Um, you acquire knowledge. I mean, you hear different teachers and professors like you, and which from that you learn a different way of viewing things. And as you grow older and have experiences of your own, those things have to play a part in it as well. And so for me, again, I see the Scriptures much more metaphorically today than I did 50, 60 years ago.
And I think maybe one of the main points is this: you have heard it said, but I say to you. And so people have been struggling with this interpretation for forever. You have heard it said that you should hate your enemies, but I say to you, love your enemies. Those are teachings that are flipping things upside down on their head. And so I don't think we're done having things flipped upside down in our world where we live today. What are we going to do about COVID? All these things are new challenges to us, but we're trying to figure out what would Jesus say to us on those challenges.
Do you think if Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount today, he would preach it differently than he did back then?
Yeah, I think that he was probably gearing things to what the audience had. He was always using things that were familiar to people in his audience. So sheep and goats, and the Samaritans. Those things he was preaching about were all very familiar. So I would guess that he's going to be preaching about things that we all are talking about. And he certainly didn't preach about sexual sin as much as he did about money.
Would he be more tolerant today in his teachings?
Yeah, good question.
Well, I've been thinking about parables some in the last few months when we talked about a few of them. And what I'm seeing is the parables don't tell you what to do so much as raise issues for you to think about in a different way. Because people, there's places in Scripture say, well, and they're amazed at Jesus' teaching, or it's not like here's 3 steps and go live this way. That's not what Jesus did for the most, not even here in the Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, you've heard it said, but I'm going to say to you, and yeah, it's interesting.
Well, the new pope is certainly more forgiving, and if that tells us anything, Pope Francis.
And I think the Catholic Church's view on birth control and all that sort of thing has liberalized considerably, or at least that's the way it seems to me in talking with Catholic folk.
Right. Yeah, it hasn't.
Well, there's the right wing and the left wing of the Catholic Church, and you have 1.5 billion people, and that means they cover the whole spectrum. And there are an awful lot of people in the Catholic Church, including cardinals, that hate Pope Francis. They hate him with a passion.
I suppose that's right.
Well, that's biblical. Love your enemies.
Well,
Unless you're Cardinal Burke, yes, yes.
I think it's on Netflix. I can't remember the name of the show that showed Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and their relationship. You know, Pope Benedict is much more conservative than Francis is, and you know, and he's a resigned pope. You know, he hasn't passed away yet. So anyway. It's just you know, of course, it's Netflix, whatever, but it's an illustration of that kind of, you know, loggerhead kind of stuff. And I mean, I grew up as a Catholic, and I know, I mean, it's been 40 years now, but I'm familiar with some of that discussion, I guess. Yeah.
There's labor priests, and you know they were radicals, and they were hated by the conservative, um, um, what do you call it, establishment priest, and so yeah, there's always been tensions. Interesting. Well, I think we've pretty much covered our shot. I'm looking forward to concerning oaths, and that's a big topic in text and transit. One of the things that have made brethren peculiar people or separate people is they're taking that part literally. Once again, they've chosen that part to be literal about. So that will be verses 33 and following. So we might, what I think we'll try to do next week. I'm involved in a compassionate listening, compassionate speaking exercise with some people in the district, and Larry happens to be one of them, I think. So we might end up a little bit earlier next week so that we can hop onto the other conversation. So we'll get started with that, taking oaths literally, and see where we get. And then we'll see next week. What is it? We have, what's today, the 9th? So we might, next week might be our last one for a while since the holidays are coming up. We'll probably take a breather then. Any thoughts, any preferences here on how long we're going to meet?
I think it's good to take a breather, probably for the holidays. I also wanted to say on Jesus' teaching, he also said, "Judge not that you be not judged." So put some of this in that light too.
Right. I can't wait till we get to that verse. I got to take that one literally. All right. Well, thanks everybody. See if I can stop share. Good to see everybody, and stay well. We'll hope to see you next week then.